Greetings and welcome to Spade, the Japanese Navy. In this video I'll be going over the capital ships of the Japanese Navy in Update 2.7 Red Skies. These are the most powerful type of vessel currently available in the game and have caused quite some grief to the naval community upon the release. Before we get into them, I must add that I'm in no way an excellent captain when it comes to these ships. I've only played the Japanese ones so far, so there might be various points in this video where I either just don't have the knowledge I'd like to have, or more experienced captains would just disagree with me, so keep this in mind. But now, onto the ships. Up first, Ikoma, an armoured cruiser with an identity crisis and the only vessel of its type at 5.7. Why is that? Let's take a closer look. Ikoma carries a total of 4 305mm guns in 2 dual mounts, both centerline mounted, with one being at the front of the ship and one at the rear. These guns get a choice between high explosive and armor piercing shells. I suggest mainly using the armor piercing shells as there's no other 5.7 cruiser that can resist them. The high explosive isn't that well suited for fighting other cruisers, but can do a thing or two when fired into their superstructure. This firepower, however, comes at a cost. The mounts have a very slow traverse rate, so you better know in which direction you want to shoot beforehand, and then there's the reload rate. This varies from 39 to 30 seconds depending on your crew skill, but this is all to be expected of guns these sizes. I must note that the gunner camera seems to be placed ahead of the front turret. This could mean that your shells often seem to fall slightly behind your aiming point. Other than these minor inconveniences, this is a powerful main armament. During the stretches of time where Ikoma reloads, she can still dish out damage thanks to her secondaries. There are a total of 12 152mm guns and 12 120mm guns, 6 of each on either side of the ship. This secondary armament puts some of the earlier cruisers to shame in the firepower department. The 120mm guns only have high explosives to fire, and their rather low velocity doesn't help them either. But the 152mm guns get the choice between high explosive and armor piercing shells. I suggest, when you unlock them, to exclusively use the armor piercing shells on these guns, as they can damage cruisers quite well at closer ranges. As a little tip, with my crew it takes around 3 salvos with the secondaries before the primaries are reloaded, so try and see how many secondary salvos your Ikoma can fire before the main guns are reloaded. But there are still more guns. Ikoma also has 4 additional 76mm guns, 2 mounted on each main gun turret. These are loaded with high explosive timefuse rounds and cannot be swapped with any other round. This means that these guns serve as your anti-air, and they're all you have for anti-air too. They're not the worst guns for the role with their decent rate of fire, but they do have a rather poor maximum elevation and restricted rotation too. This, paired with the fact that they're mounted on top of the main gun turrets, can make their effectiveness rather unpredictable. I highly suggest dodging incoming attacks rather than relying on these guns. Now, this ship also carries torpedoes. Shocking, yes, but they're not really worth talking about. There are 3 submerged tubes, one on each side of the ship, just below the front main turret, and one at the very rear facing rearwards, carrying a total of 17 torpedoes, which are shared between these launchers. Oddly enough, the rear and the right hand side torpedo tube have a total of 6 torpedoes each allocated to them, while the one on the left hand side only has 5. These torpedoes have a range of 8 km and a top speed of 50 km an hour, which isn't too bad for torpedoes of this era, but what makes them bad is a small payload of 143 kg of TNT equivalent. This is so low that it will barely trouble destroyers. For an anecdote, I once got into a short-range brawl with a German battleship, fired a torpedo, which was set at a 4-meter depth setting at it. It hit the German, but in the hit cam I only saw the message, non-penetration. I believe that should tell you enough about the effectiveness of these torpedoes. I cannot recommend taking them with you into battle. As for the mobility, here we see one of the defining traits of the capital ships, their slow top speed. And with Ikoma coming in with its stock top speed of 35 km an hour, we see the limiting factor of these ships. I don't think that the spading of the vessel will make it much better, as Ikoma's top speed then becomes 41 km an hour. And that's not all, she's rather slow to respond from the helm and slow in the turn itself. On the topic of her turn, Ikoma lists very heavily while fully turning, so much so that she practically cannot use her guns while in a full turn. So just be aware of that. The one good thing at least is that her turning circle is relatively small. It just takes a while for Ikoma to complete this circle. And as for another defining trait of these ships, their survivability. Now I must admit that when it comes to survivability I find these ships hard to judge, but Ikoma is tough, very tough, just not impenetrable. She can take damage when shot at by heavy cruisers, but not so much that you'd have to be worried about it. Other capital ships, however, have little problem poking Ikoma full of holes. You shouldn't be too afraid of getting detonated in your frontal magazine, but Ikoma's rear magazine is somewhat vulnerable, so keep that in mind when you want to juke it out at close range. Other than that, you'll just have to figure it out for yourself when to be aggressive, or when to stay in cover. One thing I must note is that for some reason Ikoma is very susceptible to rolling over due to flooding that should only be a minor problem to other ships. So do keep your eyes peeled for torpedoes while sailing Ikoma. When it comes to playstyle, I'm again a bit stumped when it comes to describing it for Ikoma. There's very little you can do wrong, but I would suggest staying close to teammates if you want anti-air cover. Otherwise, try to get close to the enemy so that your guns can be used optimally. Just be aware of torpedoes if you do close in. Pros: good armor, good overall firepower. Cons: mediocre mobility, unreliable anti-aircraft firepower, low number of main guns. Verdict: spaded. It's just barely a spaded verdict, as I find Ikoma rather unsatisfying to play, as a low number of main guns can make them feel rather lackluster. But her secondaries and tough armor more than make up for it in my eyes. She's certainly not on par with the other vehicles on this list, or even the other vehicles of this type in other nations, but I believe she firmly stands above the other 5.7 vessels. Now, onto an actual battleship, Settsu, a Kawachi class. She's often neglected in favor of the other battleship in a Japanese tree, but does Settsu deserve more attention? Let's take a look. As usual, we'll first look at the main armament. Settsu carries a total of 12 305mm guns, these being in 6 dual mounts. 4 of these are wing mounted, 2 on each side of the ship. The remaining 2 mounts are located along the center line, with 1 at the front and 1 at the rear of the ship. But there's a unique trait to Setsu's guns: they aren't uniform. The wing mounted guns are the same guns as Ikoma, which are 45 calibers long, while the centerline guns are 50 calibers long. This means that while firing a full broadside, half of the shells are slower than the other half. It doesn't have much effect on the high explosive shells, as they still have the same bursting charge. You'll just have a difference in impact time. But when you compare the 2 armor-piercing shells, there's a large difference in penetration. Setsu's main guns don't exactly have the best dispersion either. This combined with the somewhat poor penetration means that you cannot meaningfully engage other battleships at longer ranges. But don't be discouraged too much, hostile cruisers will still not be able to resist Setsu's gunfire. As for her secondaries, Settsu carries 10 152mm guns and 8 120mm guns, split evenly on both sides of the ship, with the 152s being concentrated closer to the center of the ship, while the 120s are found closer to the extremities. They are the same guns as found on the Ikoma, just in lesser numbers. These also carry the same shells, the 120mm guns only getting high explosive shells, and the 152mm guns getting the choice between high explosive and armor piercing. I still recommend mainly using the armor piercing shells on these guns, as that will be more effective against most other vessels you'll face. Settsu is less reliant on her secondaries compared to Ikoma, so I personally use her secondaries very little, but if you sail her, just experiment and see what you can do with them. And just like Ikoma, Settsu has 2 76mm guns on each turret, for a total of 12. They are loaded with high explosives time-fuse shells and cannot equip any other shell type. They still have the rather restricted elevation and horizontal arc, but with their increased number they stand a chance to actually knock out an approaching lone flying aircraft. And they're not her only anti-air weapons. Settsu also carries 4 6.5mm machine guns, 1 on each side of the bridge and rear conning tower. Settsu carries quite a heavy anti-air suite for a battleship, but I wouldn't rely on it to get her out of trouble. And there are again torpedoes in 3 submerged tubes, 1 on either side behind the rearmost main turret, and 1 poking out of the rear of the ship. The ones on the side each have 4 torpedoes, and the one pointing out of the rear has 1, making for a total of 9 torpedoes. They're very weak, with a range of 5 km and a top speed of 48 km an hour, and a poor payload of 104.5 kg of TNT equivalent. I just wouldn't take them with you into battle, though keep in mind that they're an option during the rest of our review. As for her mobility, Settsu is sluggish with a top speed of 33 km/h stock. Her rudder responsiveness isn't much better, nor is her turning itself. Her maneuverability and mobility will make you curse at your helmsman when you first get Settsu. But I will say that it becomes manageable when you get all of the seakeeping modifications, with her top speed then reaching 39 km/h and her rudder being faster to respond than a lazy sloth. Now onto the more complicated part, her armor. At first glance you'd think that her protection is alright, but comparing her to other battleships of similar type you'll notice some flaws. Firstly, her actual armored belt doesn't cover much more than the waterline. Most of her armor doesn't exceed 179mm, with the exceptions being the barbettes, being 100mm thicker, at 279mm. This is good and all for repelling cruiser fire at range, but what about taking fire from battleships? Well, they'll just go through the outer belt with little problem. So what can we find internally? Well, nothing much. Settsu has no turtleback armor, none at all. She has some coal bunkers, but they only protect the engines. The ammunition is protected by what can be at best described as 28mm thick boxes, and the shell room are dangerously close to peaking above the waterline. The turrets also have 279mm thick armor on most of the vertical armor, except for the wing turrets, which have 254mm of underside. This is alright for the most part, but they only have 76mm of roof armor. This means that most of the armor-piercing shells of the ships you'll face can knock out your turrets just by hitting the roof of it. Settsu is tough, all battleships are, but she has her weaknesses. I implore you to always angle, no matter what shoots at you, angle, angle, angle. You'll last so much longer if you do. So now, how do I think you should play Settsu? As I said at the start, capital ships are a bit out of my league of experience, but I personally play Settsu as a brawler. Her guns and mobility are mainly the reason for this. I find that I cannot reliably use the guns at range and her overall mobility isn't too bad, so I close the distance, preferably to an isolated capture point or other type of choke point. And it is playing like this where you might find a use for the torpedoes I mentioned earlier. I personally don't, as their payload seems too small to really do anything, but please try it out yourself. I've had fun with Settsu playing her like this, but it is usually while closing the distance that you're at the greatest risk. As Settsu is easily outgunned by other battleships at range, and she isn't exactly the fastest. Though this is also my experience in the spade at Settsu. I would suggest being a bit more picky with your fires while stock, but still try to close the distance and don't forget to angle. Pros: alright anti-air, alright maneuverability spaded. Cons: lackluster main guns, unreliable armor. Verdict: consider it. What? A capital ship you shouldn't automatically spade? I know, but I don't consider Settsu to be particularly powerful when compared to her peers. Still powerful enough to beat a cruiser to a pulp, but not powerful enough to really call herself an equal to some of the other capital ships out there. Now, the pinnacle of the current Japanese Blue Water tree and quite a controversial ship when it was introduced. Coming to the game unannounced and unexpected, Ise-class battleship Hyuga. She's unlike the other capital ships we currently have. Let's see why. First, and probably most notably, her main guns. Hyuga carries 12 356mm guns and 6 dual mounts, all centerline mounted. There are 3 super firing pairs, with 2 of them traversing in the rearward arc of the ship and 1 in the forward arc. These are the biggest guns in the game at the moment, and Hyuga is the only ship that currently has them. Can you see why that Hyuga coming in unannounced was somewhat controversial? These guns get the choice between semi-armor piercing and an armor piercing shell, with semi-armor piercing being your main shell choice, though I personally prefer using the armor piercing shell for fighting battleships or just engaging any target at long range. With a reload speed again varying from 39 to 30 seconds flat, depending on your crew skills. I can't really say much about these guns other than that they're nuts. There is very little a ship can do to negate damage from them, and with 12 shells barreling towards a target per salvo, you really don't want to appear in a Hyuga's crosshair. As for her secondaries, she carries a total of 20 140mm guns, 10 on each side. These are the same guns that can be found on Kuma and Sendai as their primaries, which can only bear 6 of these upon a target, and they're in the same BR bracket as Hyuga, just to remind you. They only get one shell type, semi-armor piercing, specifically the worst of the 2 semi-armor piercing shells you can find on Kuma or Sendai. These secondaries aren't of much use against the later cruisers, though they are useful against smaller vessels like coastal ones or destroyers. You can ignore these secondaries for the most part, though you can sort of use them as a shotgun for low-flying aircraft. It can sometimes be enough to give approaching aircraft a scare, as your regular anti-aircraft weapons won't. While on the topic, Hyuga's anti-air consists of 6 7.72mm machine guns, 2 on either side of the bridge, 2 on either side of the ship between the 2 smoke funnels, and 2 on either side of the rear mast. They are rather ineffective, but better than nothing. An honorable mention when it comes to Hyuga's anti-air is her rear mast. You'd be surprised how many planes have flown into it when I spaded Hyuga. I believe the amount of kills it claimed has gone into the double digits by now, which is more than I can say for the 7.72s. And last, and in this case most certainly least, Hyuga's torpedoes. I almost don't want to mention them as they have so little use to Hyuga, but for those who are interested, there are 6 submerged tubes, 3 on either side. There are no reload for them, so you only get the 6 torpedoes in total. These torpedoes have a range of 8 km and a speed of 50 km an hour. These are the same torpedoes as on Ikoma, so they only have a payload of 143 kg of TNT equivalent. I already talked about their effectiveness on Ikoma, and they're of no better use on Hyuga. There's really no need to equip them, but you're as always free to find out for yourself. When it comes to mobility, Hyuga is above average in the speed department for the battleship, coming in at 38 km an hour stock. And when spaded, this becomes 44 km an hour. But her turning circle is rather large, and particularly slow when stock. It doesn't become incredible when spaded, but certainly better. As for Hyuga's armor, she's rather well protected overall, with a tough belt resistant to almost all cruiser fire, and coal bunkers protecting most of the center of the ship. There is, however, some glaring weak points that is often the cause of Hyuga's demise. The frontal ammo storage is one of them. The armor cover here is very thin and can be panned by almost all heavy cruisers firing armor piercing. The rear ammo storage is also quite vulnerable, but in a case more specifically to plunging fire, as it's only covered by 32mm thick anti-fragmentation plate for the roof between the 2 rearmost turrets. You certainly don't want to take battleship cells to either of these places, as they'll certainly lead to Hyuga's demise. So should you try an angle like Settsu? Yes, angling is always good, but it won't cover these weak spots too much, as no matter how you angle, you'll either present the front or rear magazine to enemy fire. I suggest finding some solid cover or actively dodging shells when you see them coming dangerously close to your magazine, though this latter option is more difficult than it sounds. So Hyuga has some glaring weak points. How do you play her then? Well, in my experience, Hyuga is better suited to long-range engagements. Her many large caliber guns still pack a hefty punch even at the longest ranges. You'll want to use your decent mobility to make yourself a difficult target. While Hyuga is quite a presence anywhere on the battlefield, the closer she gets to the enemies, the more vulnerable she becomes. So keep your distance and focus on the enemy battleships, as your guns are the best suited to take them out, and they're also the biggest threat to Hyuga's survival. Pros: excellent firepower, decent mobility. Cons: vulnerable magazines, poor anti-aircraft firepower. Verdict: spaded. Hyuga is currently one of the top dogs when it comes to naval. I would be mad to give her any verdict other than this one. Just be aware that she isn't perfect. And with all capital ships, you might have to fork over a fortune if you do sink, but it should be well worth it. And that is it, the last 3 ships I had to cover to complete this series on the Japanese tree. All in all, I would say that the Japanese tree is a solid one, though not very friendly to the new players into the game mode. I recommend starting out with one of the big 3 nations if you're not yet fully familiar with naval. But once you do gain that experience, the Japanese naval tree should be a fun one to spade. Thank you all for watching, goodbye, and may the seas be calm. I'm not quite done yet, however. As some of you may have noticed, I started this channel with a series, but that in no way means I'm going to end it with this. I plan to make more videos covering, as the channel name implies, basic and advanced mechanics, strategies and other tidbits. I also plan to continue this series covering Japanese ships as they get added in future updates, as well as covering the other nations. I will also attempt to cover the naval dev blogs and dev server content, so you have yet to see the last of me. I hope to see you in the next one.